All right. Thank you so much, Jim. It's really an honor to be speaking on such a stellar panel. First, let me just say that I'm not speaking from my role at the museum. The thoughts I share are mine alone. That being said, if people have questions about the Early Warning Project, which I help to oversee, I'd be happy to put my other hat on and speak about that as well. I hope that during my time, I'll provide some framing remarks that discuss some of the psychological barriers to engaging in atrocity prevention. Many of these barriers won't be new to you, but nevertheless, they're important reminders for all of us. Most of the time, the easiest way to overcome them is to actually recognize them in our own thinking and our own actions. I'll be touching on three main challenges. But of course, given time constraints, I'm only offering a very basic foundation. But without further ado, I'll get into it. So challenge number one, we are reactive rather than preventative. Our brains aren't very good at long-term thinking. This has become a widely recognized limitation as exhibited in how we address, or perhaps don't address, issues like climate change. This is often referred to as short-termism, which is what happens when we focus on short-term results and gains at the expense of long-term interests. Studies have shown that humans consistently tend to opt for immediate rewards instead of rewards down the pike, even if the later rewards are greater. We'll take that $50 now rather than that $100 next week. Thank you very much. Studies show that most people don't think further out than 5 and even then 10 years at max. And when we're asked to think further out than that, we actually struggle. Our brain scans even show less activation the further out we're asked to think. So what this translates to in the atrocity prevention world is that there is a tendency to focus on the immediate threats and crises, and prevention often falls to the wayside. We focus on trying to put out the fires rather than preventing them in the first place. And as we know, once atrocities are underway, large-scale loss of human life has likely already occurred, and our options are limited. Not non-existent, but very limited. Atrocity prevention is a long-term endeavor. Initiatives that focus on upstream strategies involve sustained efforts to increase the capacity and resilience of societies. And these measures are forward-thinking, they're often undervalued, and sometimes even go unnoticed due to their actual success in preventing cases or the need for reactive actions. The Global Fragility Act is, of course, a step in the right direction, but we can continue to improve and ensure atrocity prevention work is being seriously integrated and monitored within it. Challenge number two, a number of quirks in our cognitive makeup can affect how we interpret and respond to relevant information. So continuing on this trend of what our brains are not good at, these cognitive limitations are relevant to policymakers and practitioners, but they also apply to the general public as well. These are human problems, so I'm not trying to point any fingers. There are a range of issues that impact how we feel and respond to information on conflict, human loss, and so on. First, when atrocities happen in far-off lands, in countries or communities that are less similar to ours, they can feel emotionally remote or not relevant. And it's this disconnect that makes it easier for us to turn a blind eye and to not get involved. This phenomenon is known as the psychological distance barrier. Second, repetitive exposure to information on conflicts, say estimates of internally displaced people or fatalities, can desensitize us. When you first heard about attacks in Burma, they might have seemed shocking. Now, they might seem normal. Our values concerning human loss likely haven't changed, but it's our response that's changed. And we don't feel as strongly. Over time, the emotional impact lessens and we become indifferent. We can become indifferent. Conflict fatigue, of course, is also at play. But what's interesting is this fatigue, this desensitization, or even compassion fade can come on faster than you might think. Considering, for example, how we respond to information about the conflict in Sudan. or even for conflicts that have gained a lot of attention, like Ukraine, I don't think I would be incorrect in saying that we're witnessing this fade to a degree. Psychic numbing is another very interesting and related concept that further illustrates that our capacity to feel is limited. Psychic numbing is the phenomenon that causes us to feel indifferent to the suffering of large numbers of people. As the numbers increase, psychic numbing begins to desensitize us. Research shows that disaster statistics, no matter how large the numbers, lack emotion or feeling. And as a result, they fail to motivate the proper action and really convey the true meaning of these calamities. A very recent example is the media coverage and resources expended on the search for the Titan submersible and its passengers versus the shipwrecked refugees in the Mediterranean Sea. It's much easier to empathize and feel compassion for 5 people rather than 750. Obviously, there are other biases operating here too. If fatalities are 200,000 or 400,000, we often perceive these as the same, even though numerically speaking, we should be doubly outraged or concerned. Basically, our feeling system can't count. And even when we do manage to overcome the desensitization and the numbing, we're faced with other barriers. Pseudo-inefficacy is a concept that refers to the feeling of helplessness or the belief that one's efforts to make a difference will be futile, even when it's technically possible to enact positive change. This ends up being especially strong when we're made aware of the broader scope of people in need that we're not able to help. For example, one study showed that people were less willing to send aid that would save a certain number of lives in refugee camps as the size of the camp's at-risk populations increased. Instead of helping those we can, we feel worse and we end up helping fewer. This is a false feeling of inefficacy because even partial solutions, of course, save whole lives. And ultimately, it's these quirks that affect our decision-making capabilities as well. The term failure of imagination is often used in psychology and other fields to describe a situation where individuals or groups are unable to foresee or imagine certain possibilities or outcomes, especially rare and unique ones, due to cognitive limitations, biases, or preconceived notions. It's essentially a failure to consider alternative scenarios or to think creatively about potential risks and consequences. And to compound this, we tend to seek out information that aligns with our pre-existing beliefs or information that's readily available. So when faced with evidence of potential atrocities, we may unconsciously downplay or reject information that contradicts our views as well. And I'm referring to the confirmation bias and the availability bias. For policymakers and practitioners, the bias that I believe is of great importance to be aware of is the prominence effect. It influences our decision-making and our perception. It occurs when individuals give greater importance or weight to information that is more defensible or prominent, rather than objectively evaluating the significance of the information. Although we have a qualitative sense of the importance of valued objectives, for example, saving money or saving lives, when objectives compete with one another, we actually struggle with making the trade-offs and choose what is best according to what is most prominent or defensible. For example, that could be national security. It may make us feel cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable feeling that occurs when our values conflict with our actions or inactions. And to reduce this discomfort, we may rationalize or avoid acknowledging atrocities. This leads to decisions that favor inaction. And finally, challenge number 3, the bureaucracy and the setup of the atrocity prevention system. First, in large organizations or governments, accountability can be diluted. This is known as diffusion of responsibility in psychology. When multiple individuals or departments share responsibility, it can become challenging to pinpoint accountability, leading once again to inaction or slow responses. The diffusion of responsibility makes it easy to deflect blame and delay action. And this can apply to the atrocity prevention field, as individuals and nations may assume that someone else will take the responsibility. And secondly, in many cases, the people who are in charge of preventing atrocities are the same people in charge of responding to current or ongoing atrocities. As I spoke about in the beginning, when given the chance, humans will prioritize the immediate concerns or threats. And I'm sure others on the panel or in this meeting will have more to add on to that point. So now that I've thoroughly depressed you, the fascinating thing about our cognitive faculties is that they don't only create the barriers, but they also provide us with the solution. The things that make us dangerous come from the things that make us smart. Atrocity prevention demands our commitment to and the application of what psychologist and Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman aptly termed slow thinking. We need to embrace thoughtful, deliberate, and strategic approaches, which involve careful risk assessment and long-term planning. Constantly reminding yourself that these biases might be present in your thinking is absolutely the easiest way to overcome them, and studies have supported this. Simulations, like the excellent ones that Jim has created, and scenarios help us to overcome the failure of imagination. Reviewing and ranking our values before we make decisions that involve trade-offs can help with the prominence effect. And of course, slowing your thinking down when you're reading large numbers can help you remember that real people are behind those figures. It's through this steadfast practice of slow thinking that we really stand the best chance of overcoming these psychological barriers. And with that, I will turn it back to Jim. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Paul, I'm going to hand the baton over to you.
Okay, well, thanks, Jim, and thanks to the Stimson Center for convening this meeting of the Atrocity Prevention Study Group. You do a terrific service, Jim, and we're all appreciative for your convening power and keeping this group together and focusing on such very useful and helpful topics at a regular basis. So appreciate that. So I've been asked, like Ashley, to sort of lay out the principal challenges to preventing mass atrocities, particularly for the United States, which I think we would all agree is the state actor with the most capacity to make a difference in this area. It's not the only, obviously, but it's the one with the greatest capacity to make a difference. Now, given the long history of non-existent, negligible, or simply failed efforts to prevent mass atrocities of varying kinds, there really is no mystery about what the main challenges are. At least I don't think so. They can more or less be grouped into three categories. Firstly, what I would call operational or instrumental impediments. Secondly, geostrategic and political impediments. And thirdly, human factor-related impediments. And we've already heard a great deal about that very usefully from Ashley. Now, to be clear, these are not distinct categories. Rather, they overlap in various ways. I like to think of them as a kind of like a Venn diagram. Most importantly, they can be mutually reinforcing in their effect or in inhibiting or constraining atrocity prevention. And I think this is an extremely important point when we think of strategies for trying to reduce the effect of these impediments, to facilitate action, to lubricate the system in various ways. I should add that these impediments are not just confined to the task of mass atrocity prevention. They affect all kinds of conflict prevention. And again, I think Ashley usefully raised a variety of ways that are applicable to conflict prevention in various kinds. So let me just quickly run through each of them very quickly. Many will be familiar to most people here, so I'm not exactly saying much that's new, but I think these three areas are worth repeating. So firstly, the operational or instrumental impediments. These are barriers that affect our awareness and understanding of what could happen, what may be about to happen, or what is happening in real time, which is the basic prerequisite for any kind of preventive action. These factors also concern the physical capacity to undertake preventive measures when the will to act actually exists. So what do I mean here? More specifically, these impediments can refer to many things. In terms of our awareness and understanding of what's happening or about to happen, they affect whether we have the intelligence assets or other sources of information devoted to a specific area, as well as the analysts to process information, and moreover, the means to issue timely early warnings that atrocities are about to happen or are happening. They also affect whether those intelligence assets, when they are available, can determine what is happening. Some things just can't be detected because of, for example, jungle foliage, dense urban environments, smoke, whatever, nighttime conditions, cloud cover, etc., as well as the deliberate acts or strategies by would-be perpetrators to hide what they are intending to do. Making sense of a situation can also be very difficult, given that most atrocities occur, as is generally acknowledged, in the context of acute civil unrest or wartime, when it's difficult to determine what is happening and who the actors are, essentially what's going on. In terms of the capacity to respond, this could mean anything from diplomatic assets and economic instruments to military capabilities that are ready to be used at any given moment. Alternatively, may require some type of or some time to mobilize and deploy for possible use. This may also involve various legislative, legal barriers too that might prevent their ready use. In some cases, doing certain things to prevent atrocities may require collaboration and coordination with other actors, both internally as well as internationally, which again can provide yet more impediments to timely preventive action. It can also mean whether we have physical access to do something. Are we excluded politically? Do we have nearby bases to carry out certain types of preventive action? The military assets to do so, are they at the ready, properly manned, et cetera, et cetera? I don't need, I think, to go into great detail here. And of course, there's the time factor too. Our ability to prevent atrocities from happening may be extremely limited given the speed with which they can occur or have happened. So turning to the second category, the geostrategic and political impediments. These are impediments that affect our motivation to act. More specifically, whether we believe it is in our interest to do so, or alternatively, whether the moral imperative to act is big enough or large enough to override what may be strong political or geostrategic disincentives to do something. So there's clearly a balance here. This general challenge is usually reduced to the catch-all term political will, which many of you have argued is not a particularly helpful term. Indeed, it can often become a convenient self-exculpatory reason for inaction. So what do we mean here? When unpacked, the lack of political will can refer to lots of different things. Again, Ashley has already foreshadowed some of them, whether the affected country and victims are geostrategically important or considered important for geostrategic or economic reasons, whether there is a domestic political constituency, particularly in the US, to act, or is actually agitating for action. The atrocity is taking place in wartime and would require costly intervention versus in otherwise peaceful circumstances, which might be easier to react to. Whether the atrocity is being carried out by a nominal ally or partner in the conflict, and therefore making restraint more problematic as a consequence. Furthermore, the atrocity is being carried out by a non-state actor that constitutes what essentially, or the atrocity constitutes what is essentially leaderless violence, where the usual array of positive and negative inducements simply don't apply. So yet another impediment. Continuing, the atrocity may come in the wake of earlier failures and thus demotivates further action. That's more or less a sort of almost a psychological impediment, but also has political attributes too. Another common problem here is that there are simply other priorities and demands on the assets to actually make addition that could make a difference. There are no political rewards, as often said, for preventing something that is difficult, if not impossible to prove would have happened in the absence of preventive action, a common problem that we often hear. And finally, that there are international legal barriers to acting, not least sovereignty concerns that would also have to be overcome, and may require a lot of political capital to do so. So thirdly, the human impediments. I think Ashley, frankly, has pretty much covered most of the main issues here. These are the psychological and physiological factors that affect or inhibit, on the one hand, how individuals and groups respond to relevant information about the necessity to act, especially in a preventive way. And on the other, and I think this is the part that Ashley didn't cover, how those considering or carrying out the atrocities respond to threats and other inducements to desist. Now, in the former case, this can refer to just the level of sort of information bandwidth and available to process information, whether there are other demands being placed on decision makers at the same time, or this overload can lead to a kind of decision paralysis. There are the physical and emotional strains on those tasked with making key decisions. As Ashley says, there's the common problem of dismissing or discounting information that doesn't conform to pre-existing priors or expectations, various biases, especially in group settings, that can be particularly important. There's the common problem of delaying or procrastinating over potentially costly decisions about problems that may never happen or may quickly disappear if they do. There's the common problem of loss aversion, fixating on known costs rather than potentially bigger costs or bigger rewards. As for the human or psychological element relating to those carrying out the atrocities, this can mean a variety of variables. There are various mental and physical factors that may prevent them from acting in a rational way or responding to rational inducements. Group pressures and other offsetting threats may counter whatever is being contemplated or implemented to make them desist from what they're doing. And various threats and inducements, frankly, may seem meaningless to them or incredible given the various setting which takes place. So taken together, these various challenges amount to, I think we would all agree, are a formidable set of impediments. There should be no illusions, therefore, about the nature of the challenge, nor should anyone believe that addressing one element in isolation of the others will necessarily make a big difference overall to the outcome. At the same time, and this is more positive, we shouldn't be totally intimidated by these impediments and conclude, in effect, that it's not worth even trying. For me, in any given situation, we should look ways to unlock these mutually reinforcing constraints or impediments. Nurturing the will to act by minimizing the impediments that undermine the capacity to act, I think is always important to do. And conversely, ensuring that there is the capacity to act when the willingness to act is already present. So when there's a will, basically, we should ensure that there is the way, and when there is not the will, we should ensure that or rather, when there is the way, we should try to ensure that there is the way present for action to take place in a timely fashion. Okay, let me end there. I'm sorry if I went over my 10 minutes, but I very much look forward to hearing what others have to say. Thank you.
No, thank you, Paul. That was great. Liz, we're going to pass over to you.
Hi, good afternoon. So thank you so much for putting this together, because I really think this is one of the crux problems of our field. And I'll touch on, when I'm talking about conflict, I'm talking about everything that results from conflict, right? So, um, you know, violent extremism, we know it's driven by conflict grievances or violent conflict. So I lump everything in with that when I'm talking about conflict, or, I'm just atrocities. So just know that that's what I'm talking about. So I'm going to start with the positive. And Ashley, I thank you so much for your discussion around brain science. I am the biggest fan of using this because we don't. And we at AFP, we really need to better understand brain science and how it applies to conflict. And we don't do a great job on it. So thank you so much. That was phenomenal. So one of the things we do know, which it was funny because you started more with the negative and then even said, have I depressed you? Well, so one of the things we also know is that when people are overwhelmed with negative, their brains turn off and they think, what does it matter? And, they want to go hide under a table somewhere. So I'm going to start with the positive. So, prior to the 1990s, we had a Cold War, there was, we weren't talking about peace building and conflict prevention. And in the 1990s, that started, the Cold War went down, the 90s, were a phenomenal decade for this work starting. You had the Agenda for Peace in the UN. You had peace agreements, Bosnia, Kosovo, the Good Friday Agreement, not perfect, but you had peace agreements. I mean, think back to the last time, you would think we'd had one. So you had a lot of optimism, and we started talking about these words and what they meant and doing research on it. One of the best things that happened is, for the last 20 years, we actually have good data through the Institute for Economics for Peace, the Fragile States Index, the OECD DAC. Like, we have so much good data now, that we can say what's working, what's not working, things have gotten better, things have not. And that's actually, I tell people all the time, we use that data to get the Global Fragility Act, because we could go to Congress and say, see, look, things are getting worse, and this is what's happening. And prior to that, we didn't have that data. So I can't, give enough kudos to that data. Okay. That being said, we all know if you're sitting in this room, or in this virtual room, we don't need to go through all the different issues that are plaguing us right now. But we do know in 2018, thanks to all that great data, we hit a global high in violent conflict and fragility. And this was before the global pandemic. And this is before we recognized how climate change was accelerating, and knowing that climate change and conflict are compounding each other. Before, remember in 2014, we thought, free flow of information and the internet was a phenomenal thing. In fact, so phenomenal that when it was put into SDG 16 as a marker of success, 2014. And that's actually one of the SDGs indicators that's gone up. We now know the good, but the bad, and how it can accelerate conflict. We know that, again, 2018, before an increase in large-scale violent conflicts, Haiti, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Sudan, Ukraine, Nagorno-Karabakh, Israel, Palestine, and what's coming next. So we are overwhelmed with violent conflict and fragility. And one more piece about this, we're seeing this increasing instability and polarization in the global north, including the United States. Just a quick little story. I was in Kosovo. I was the chief legal counsel for the OSCE mission under UNMIK. We were writing all the election laws right after the conflict. And Gore v. Bush happened. And I had people coming up to me from all over the world saying, I'm so sorry. Are you worried about your country? And I said, no, it'll be okay. It'll go to the Supreme Court. You may like or not like the decision, but it'll be okay. Well, it'll be okay. I cannot say that today. So that should tell you how what's happening in the global north, how destabilizing it is to the global south and even to our own country right here, right? So we're also dealing with these pieces of it. So it's not the 1990s anymore. It's not even 2014 anymore. I mean, who wouldn't give to go back to 2014? What we're doing is not working. It's not working. So, and it's hard right now this week to say, let's talk about prevention. It seems a little tone deaf, but it reminds me of when we have a gun shooting in the US, right? It's like, can we talk about prevention? And they're like, nope, it's too early. I was talking with somebody this morning and, because we're talking about Rome is burning. Again, tone deaf. And this person said to me, I'm sure there were some grievances there in Rome that could have been dealt with before. And so that to me was such kind of a bit of a, wait a minute, right? Now, there are a lot of good things that are happening. And, in the past 20, 25 years, we actually talk about it now. I mean, the Secretary General of the UN can't write a statement without saying conflict prevention is the priority. We got President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken to say conflict prevention is a priority when they release the country plans for the Global Fragility Act. The problem is, I call these prevention promises, and we need more accountability. So let me start with, well, there's two things that I think need to happen. We need to have a paradigm shift, a la the Universal Declaration of Human Rights 75 years ago. We need to have a universal priority following this example. We need a major paradigm shift that people can get behind. At the same time, we need to make changes within the system that might seem bureaucratic or, tweaking around the edges or, maybe not important enough. But sometimes those big changes happen within that bureaucracy. So we have to also look for those leverages and those points that we can push on. So, and let me just say another thing too. Again, this is part of that, the tweaking piece of it, and also the priority, making it a paradigm shift. If you don't have the resources, you can't do it. And again, here's another great data point. The OECD DAC in 2022, the States of Fragility report, told us 4% of official ODA goes to prevention. And even since then, the budgets are shrinking. The Swedes stopped pretty much their peace building programming. I mean, they were the people who did this. They were the people that did peace building. So where else can we go on this? And one of my big points about this is, how do we center and prioritize conflict prevention and peace building into our strategies and integrating it into other sectors? We have talked about this ad nauseum for 20 years. Do no harm, conflict sensitivity, conflict integration, right? So how do we go about this? The Global Fragility Act you know, I'm its biggest champion. We all know that. I can't have a event without saying it. There's so much in there that we know, but it also gets criticized as like, it's a bureaucratic exercise. Yeah, it is. In some ways, we call for evidence, and then we call for evidence to be applied. What's working, what's not working, that it's a 10-year strategy, that there is additional money on it, but also you have to look at the entire strategy, right? So Mozambique, perfect example. 90% of that budget is already earmarked to health. And then you have education, and then you have, so by the time you finish, 99.5% of the budget is already allocated to different sectors. And then it's like, okay, here's your $500,000 to deal with the conflict in the north. Well, that can't be. And that's what the Global Fragility Act talks about. It's that our funding has to follow our strategy, not our strategy follows our funding. And that's what happens now. And so while we have, we're seeing indicators go up in health and education, but then conflict and violence are also going up. So we have to be able to change our mindset. These laws and the way we work were set up at some point, but we have to be able to change them. And we're not getting rid of earmarks anytime soon. And, we all know that the silos and, okay, so how do we try to dig in right now? If you're talking about a health program in Mozambique and it's working in the north, why shouldn't some of that earmark be earmarked to work to integrate conflict prevention and peace building? So my new little slogan now is, we're going to earmark the earmarks. And because we have to make people do it. They're not going to do it, and they're going to tell us, please go away. You're talking about conflict. We're neutral. We know that's not the case. Okay. So it's this integration into policies and strategies and the funding. Now, herein lies the other problem. We've been really good at it. We got it into COVID-19 strategy, both under the Trump administration and the Bush administration. It was right in there. Second order issue, but it was right in there. And I asked, how much money went to it? Zero. But yet we know countries, the studies are starting to come out, countries that had higher scores of social cohesion and trust did better under the pandemic than, let's say, the United States, who set really high on the pandemic index response that should have knocked COVID out of the park. We all know what happened. It accelerated conflict dynamics here in the US, and it also made it difficult for them, for the health sector, sorry, not global health, the health sector, to implement the COVID strategy. So we got it. Oh, and we also got it into the climate strategy. We've gotten it everywhere, but it's about accountability. So then we have to follow it up and make sure that it got in there. So what, right? So it's not just what I'm calling the prevention promises. And then I want to say one other thing before I end. It's easy to always go after, well, the military, and that's so much money. And that's 100% true, 100% true. But we know, our research shows that triggers a partisan uptake. So we need to say, you might need that, but let me tell you how important peace building and prevention is as well. And this is the additive impact. Ashley, couldn't agree more. The interconnectedness piece. We know with Americans, we've done research on Americans, trying to get people to become champions and understand what peace building is. Focusing in on that interconnectedness, what happens there, impacts here. And we as a field have to do better. We are the wonkiest, sometimes boringest, technical people. How we all say it. Does your mom know what you do? right? My mom had no idea what I was doing, and trying to explain it to her. So we have to get better at saying, this is what we do, this is what happens, we do what we do, and this is why it's so critical. And get away from sort of that wonkiness. And I just want to see if there was anything else. But I Ashley, the same, the short term, long term, right now, from a prevention perspective, we are so focused in on China, 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 China. And that could be one of our perils. We have to start looking at the long term. We have to build prevention champions. We have to make things more accountable when we have gotten them into strategies and laws. And more importantly, we need a prevention paradigm shift that is, a la the Universal Human Rights Declarations or something like that. I'll stop now, but that's pretty much, you can tell I'm a bit passionate about this. And this needs to be the focus, in my opinion, for the next 5 to 10 years.